that would involve telling the true story of America's past, particularly with respect to slavery, the Civil War, and the Reconstruction era.
Fox News is screaming that's critical race theory.
Well, yes. Well, I think we had was it Clint Smith on the other day who said 8% of high school seniors, I think it was, are not aware that the Civil War was fought, that the Confederacy was fighting to protect slavery. And so well needed. So, but give me a sense of what the other aspects. Okay, so I mean, there's the argument that almost legalistic that there is money owed. Period. End of story. But what would you see as the second order impact of these payments? And we're talking about $800,000. Is that it per person?
No, not per person, per household.
Per household.
Individually, it's somewhere between $280,000 to $320,000.
And I think the total I've seen is about approximately $11 trillion.
That's right. That's the low end estimate. Yeah.
And it could be, like you say, amortized over the course of 10 years, 20 years. It could be a pension type of situation, in the way that we're going to be doing.
Yeah. I mean, we're somewhat open-minded about how it could be done as long as it took the form of direct payments. We would like to see it done within the course of a decade.
Okay. And so, $1.1 trillion over the course of, per year doesn't seem like that much money, frankly, relatively speaking. But what do you perceive to be the second order benefits, both for Black people and for the U.S. society at large from this, aside from the idea of we can begin to sort of address this issue that has dominated our politics since day one. What do you see as the other sort of material benefits that could emanate from something like this?
So I'm not sure this is a material benefit per se, although I'm going to use the term material in a moment. But I'm not sure these are second order benefits. I mean, maybe they're really first order benefits. But the first consequence of a reparations plan of this scale and magnitude would be to provide Black Americans with the material basis for full citizenship. And the reparations claim is ultimately a claim for full citizenship. And then the second dimension of this that's related is that the country's claim of being a democracy might truly get fulfilled.
I mean, that's pretty big one. So how does, I mean, and maybe this is just simply, let me bring up a couple of potential critiques and political difficulties. What do you say about the idea of, well, we also owe reparations to Native Americans. There have been instances where we have inhibited the wealth of Chinese Americans and Japanese Americans, Mexican Americans. Is that, I mean, what are the implications of those claims relative to what you're proposing?
So, our position is we welcome any community that has a belief that they've been victimized by the U.S. government to bring forward their own case for reparations. It's not the one that we've developed in From Here to Equality. Ours is very specific to Black Americans who have enslaved ancestors in the United States. However, I also want to point out that it's somewhat peculiar to us that when the case is being made for Black Americans, suddenly an array of other groups are brought on board and are asked, Black Americans are asked, well, why aren't you including these other groups? Well, when the German government paid reparations to the victims of the Holocaust, nobody asked about other groups. When the U.S. government paid money to the Japanese Americans who had been subjected to unjust incarceration during World War II, people didn't ask, well, what about Black Americans? and they shouldn't have. And I think in a similar context here, the question of reparations for other groups is not relevant to the claim that's being made here.
What do you see about the? I mean, do you have a political argument or an argument to the I guess the argument that, like, oh, this is just not politically feasible. It will be too divisive. It will let's not address the we can afford it. We can afford it. That to me is clear. But what would you say to those people? Say, well, this is going to be too divisive. It's going to 70 million people voted for Donald Trump. We don't want to really upset, part of the country, critical race theories, whatever it is. What do you say to that argument?
Well, we just, Carson and I just completed an article for Rolling Stone that came out on Juneteenth, where one of the points that we address is people's concerns about divisiveness. And of course, I think that the maintenance of a system of racial oppression is intrinsically divisive. And in every instance in which an attempt has been made to bring Black Americans to full citizenship in the United States, in every instance, this has been perceived as something that's divisive because there's opposition to it. The mere fact or existence of opposition is not a justification for not pursuing the right thing to do. Certainly, there was substantial opposition to the elimination of slavery. It could be viewed as a situation in which the abolitionist position was divisive, although ultimately I can't imagine anything more divisive than the secession of the 11 Confederate states. But yeah, just because something may be viewed antagonistically by some segment of our population doesn't mean it's not the right thing to do. It does mean that the struggle will be hard to win. But that's a struggle that needs to be undertaken. And so we're not particularly concerned about the question of divisiveness because we think that the structure of inequality in the United States, racial inequality, is divisive in and of itself.
Right.
Do you have?
I mean, it's also a little bit hard to believe that at this point, like, we wouldn't want there to be racism in this country that emanate from this. I mean, let's be honest.
Right.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Do you have concerns that, I would imagine you do have this concern, policy would have to be structured in this way, that banks would seize some of the payments paid out by the government in order to cover debts, and just it's reminiscent of how there's this lawsuit against the USDA because of these payments to Black farmers that the Biden administration is trying to do.
So there were actually two lawsuits, the Pigford 1 and Pigford 2, and then the Biden administration brought forth a proposal to make some payments to the farmers who had been subjected to discrimination by the USDA. But if I recall correctly, in that recent proposal, the amount was approximately $5 billion. And the estimates that I've seen of how much the farmers lost as a consequence of USDA policies are closer to $250 to $300 billion. So this is, in some sense, really, really a very modest attempt to try to address the issue. But in terms of thinking about the consequences of doing this, whether or not there is a path towards making this happen, I certainly recognize that it's highly unlikely that the existing Congress would even approach adopting a comprehensive national reparations plan. But that means that the political issue is still out there. The question of changing who is actually our elected officials in Congress, and that is a struggle that needs to be waged with an eye towards determining whether or not the people who come into Congress will be supportive of reparations.
Along those lines, as a political matter, is there a Is there a dovetail, or is there a strategy, a political strategy to dovetail with other movements? And B, to what extent, from my vantage point, and maybe it's somewhat limited, there is a far greater growth of interest in socialism, social democracy, at least amongst younger people. To what extent does the idea of reparations in any way conflict with a broader sense of class analysis and of providing on a class basis as opposed to a racial one? I mean, obviously you've made the case as to why this is sort of like basically a legal case in many instances, but as a political matter, what's your sense of that? And is there, aside from let's get better people in Congress, is there a political strategy?
Well, I think that I want to go back to getting better people in Congress. I think we have the potential for doing that because there has been a sea change in attitudes about reparations in particular. So if we went back to the year 2000, there was a survey that was conducted by Michael Dawson and Ravana Popoff at the University of Chicago. It was a survey of American attitudes towards reparations. And they found that only 4% of white Americans in the year 2000 endorsed reparations for Black Americans. By the year 2018, that percentage had risen to about 16, still low, but significantly higher than 4%. And as of the midpoint of this year, the most recent surveys that I've seen indicate that closer to 30% of white Americans now say that they would endorse reparations for Black Americans. And if we start talking about millennials, it's somewhere in the vicinity of half of millennials who say that they endorse reparations for Black Americans. So there is a change in attitudes. There is, of course, the 30% of the population that will never be receptive to this idea. But the question is whether or not the remaining 70% will continue to move in the right direction. So I think that's certainly a possibility. Now, from the standpoint of having a unified movement across multiple groups in the society, note again that I've said that I'm an advocate of an economic bill of rights for the 21st century, which would be a social program for all Americans that would provide everyone with economic security. But I don't see that as something that is in opposition to or a substitute for a reparations plan. I think that they're complementary.
Sandy Darity, Professor of Economics and the Samuel Du Bois Cook Distinguished Professor of Public Policy at Duke. The book is From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. We'll put a link to that at majority.fm. Thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
All right, folks, quick break, and we'll be right back. Finish this up. I have to say, I do feel remiss as to not asking the professor about a legal case. One wonders if there couldn't be some form of mass tort case. This is going to give me a reason to go to the Vegas Mass Tort Conference this year.
Yes, we know how much you love tort.
I do. Yeah. But with that said, we're going to have to say goodbye to our Peacock viewers because we're going to go into the fun half. We're going to talk about Steven Crowder for an extended period of time because, well,
obvious reasons.
We have to.
Yep.
Until then, we will see you tomorrow. Don't forget.